Welcome to Quilt Concert 2023, Twinkle Twinkle. Today we are constructing Block 4, Wheel of Fortune. If you would like more information on foundation paper piecing tools, machine setup, and advanced techniques for foundation paper piecing, please check out the video tutorial for Block 2, Cross Canoes, and the blog posts linked in the description below. Let's start constructing Block 4 of the 2023 Quilt Concert Series, Wheel of Fortune.
Today we are working on Quilt Concert Block 4, which is the traditional Wheel of Fortune block. You're going to want to print out the templates for this page and do the rough cutting if you would like to follow along with how I'm foundation paper piecing. Whenever you print out any template, it's important to locate the 1-inch square and measure that to make sure that nothing weird happened between your computer and the printer. There are pieces A, B, C, and D. A and B will be just a different color variation from C and D. To begin, we're going to work on piece A, and I'm going to rough cut around all my template edges. As you work with foundation paper piecing, you're going to look at the hatch marks on each piece. And so for my piece 1 is going to be fabric E, which for me is this coral color. And fabric 2 is the background color, which is shown with these equilateral triangles. That's the light green. These are the pieces that I'm going to use for template B, so I'm going to set those aside momentarily. I like to use a Lightbox to help with the placement of my fabric pieces on my foundation paper piecing template. The process for foundation paper piecing includes folding and placing your fabric pieces. Then you stitch, then you trim and press and repeat. So I folded on the line between section 1 and section 2 of the first piece. Section 1 is going to fit on my coral color of fabric E, and I want to make sure that when I place my fabric, it's going to cover all of section 1 plus at least 1/4 of an inch. And so that 1/4 of an inch for most of this piece is already drawn because it's the outer edge of the block. When I fold this, I can trim away because that is going to be the end of my piece. And then I'm going to pull out the next piece of fabric, which we already talked about was going to be fabric A, which is my background. And when you are positioning this piece, you just want to make sure that however you position it, while the template is folded, if it covers while it's folded, it will cover when it's unfolded. As you can see, I have the line for section 2 plus at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around. I'm going to slide this up to the edge because there's no need to trim right now if I do this. And then I'm ready to unfold and go to the sewing machine. When you are foundation paper piecing, you will want to make sure that you place the fabric on the unprinted side of the template, but you're going to stitch with the printed side up. Select a short stitch length. I like a 2 on my machine, and I like to start stitching right where the lines intersect with one another. I take a couple of stitches forward, then I like to back stitch 2 or 3 stitches, and then continue forward, stitching the entire line. When I come to the end of the stitch row, I like to back stitch right where those lines intersect, and then I use the automatic cut function on my machine if that's available. We're going to press the sections between pieces 1 and 2. When you're ready to do section 3, you place your ruler or you can use an index card. For more information about tools, please check out the link in the description below. And we're going to fold on the line between sections 2 and 3. I'm going to flip that at 1/4 plus ruler over and then trim. We're trimming at 1/4 of an inch because that is the seam allowance that we are using. And then I'm going to position it on my other pre-cut piece that we had rough cut using the instructions in the pattern. I've positioned it so that section 3 is completely covered while the paper is folded with the fabric, and it is covered that section plus at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around. I'm going to start stitching right at the beginning of the line, take a couple of back stitches. When I come to the end of the line, also take a couple of back stitches, and then we're ready to press. We're going to go ahead and press section 3 into place. Having a mini iron near your machine is a very helpful tool. And then we are going to take our add a quarter plus ruler and we're going to fold on the line between section 4 and the previously stitched sections. Once that's folded, I'm going to trim that at 1/4 of an inch. You can use a regular ruler, or the add a quarter ruler has that ridge built in. And for this piece, we just want to make sure that the entire section 4 is covered, plus at least 1/4 of an inch to encompass all those seam allowances. And then we're heading back over to the sewing machine. When you're ready to start stitching, we're going to stitch right on that line. Remember to back stitch a couple of stitches and then back stitch again at the end of the line. We're doing our final press for section A of block 4. Once this is foundation paper pieced, you can see how all of our pieces have covered our template. Now take one of your regular rotary cutting rulers and trim. Now that you've trimmed all the way around, we are done with section A and we're ready to move on to section B. We're ready to start section B of the Wheel of Fortune block. Once again, I find the 1-inch square. I double check to make sure that it matches the 1-inch measurements on my ruler. Then I do a rough cut around the edges of the block. Section B also has 4 sections, and piece 1 is going to be my fabric F, which is this light violet, and piece 2 is my background fabric, which is this light green. We are, as always, going to place our fabric on the back of the template and stitch on the front. I'm aligning my index card, or in this case my add a quarter ruler, with the line between sections 1 and 2 to create a crease. I want to position fabric 1 first, which is that light violet, and I want to make sure that the section 1 is completely covered, plus at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Along that fold line, I need to trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I place my add a quarter plus ruler there to get that nice 1/4 of an inch. If you don't have this ruler, you can use your regular rotary cutting ruler. For the next part of my stitching, I'm keeping this folded and I'm covering with the fabric the entire section of section 2 while it's folded, plus at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Place that add a quarter plus ruler on there. You can trim away the excess. Now we go over to the sewing machine. When you're foundation paper piecing, we place the fabric on the unprinted side, but we stitch on the printed portion of the template. I like to start right where those lines intersect, take a couple of back stitches, and then as I approach the end, I'm going to back stitch again and cut those threads. Over at the iron, we make sure that we give a nice press. You can see section 1 is completely covered, and so is section 2, plus at least 1/4 of an inch on all sides. I'm going to fold on the line between section 3, which is what we're about to add our fabric for, and the previously stitched sections. Then I trim to 1/4 of an inch, and I'm ready to position my next fabric. My next fabric is this dark violet, and I want to make sure that the entirety of section 3 is covered, plus at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around. If I have some excess, I can trim that now. We're back at the sewing machine to sew between section 3 and all of the previously stitched sections. I start where those lines intersect. I like to take a couple of back stitches and then I stitch forward. I like to back stitch and then cut my threads. When we're ready to iron section 3 into place, you unfold and just give it a nice press. And we're ready to add section 4, which is the final section for our template B. Fold on the line between section 4 and the previously stitched sections, then trim the excess away to leave 1/4 inch seam allowance. And place your final piece, which is another background fabric piece, onto the template. And you want to make sure that this covers all of section 4 plus 1/4 inch all of the way around. We start by unfolding the paper template, back stitching where those lines intersect, stitching the seam between section 4 and the previously pieced sections, back stitching, and cutting our threads. We're giving one press to our section B template here, and then we're going to be ready to trim. Trim on the outermost section of template B, so that outermost line. There we have section B completed. Flip it over, and now we're ready to put together our block.
Block assembly.
When you're ready to assemble the block, take a moment to check the layout on the pattern and compare that to the layout of your block itself. Once you know you've positioned your section A, B, C, and D in the correct places, we're ready to put things together. You're going to start by creating quadrants. So A and B here are going to be put together, C and D here, another A and B, and another C and D. When I'm ready to assemble, I like to use a combination of clips, such as these, and pins. To get a good position, I like to start by putting a pin straight through the end of one segment and through the other. It's important to hit the exact point where the inner lines come together. If I don't hit it on the first try, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to keep pushing my pin, pulling it out and putting it in until I do hit that particular point. And I'm just going to leave that pin hanging out there perpendicular and do the exact same thing on the other end of the seam. Pin goes straight through. Make sure you're starting on the same template side. And then poke through, guessing and checking until you've gone through that exact point on the other side where you want those templates to match. With your two ends in place, I like to go ahead and make sure that that pin is perpendicular, that the edges of my cut template should be lining up pretty nicely if I trimmed well, and then put a clip right next to that pin. Then I'll do the exact same thing on the opposite end, make sure that pin's perpendicular and that my edges are meeting nicely. At this point, I find the halfway point or something close to it. If it's not exact, don't worry about it. Put a pin straight through both layers, and if you're lucky, and I was, it went right through the line on both sides. Once again, make sure it's perpendicular, the edges are lined up, and add a clip. Halfway in between two of my clips and pins, I'm going to take another pin and poke it through. This is also lining up nicely. Because I'm having these things line up well, this is probably going to be my last pin that I put in here between the first clip and the second clip. Pin goes straight through. It's going through both lines and hitting both, so I can be reasonably certain that these lines are probably lining up nicely all the way across the seam. At this point, I pull out the pins next to each clip except the first one, because I pull this first clip early on before I've started stitching. I want to keep that pin there to help position things. Now that I'm at the sewing machine, I'm going to first remove that initial clip, and I'm keeping my pin in place as long as I can to help keep things aligned. If you have a knee lift that helps you with your presser foot, that's a good time to use it. Notice I start stitching at the edge of the template. When I come to the point where the lines intersect, that's where I do a couple of back stitches. I'm removing the clips as I stitch along. And then as I approach the final point, I'm going to back stitch and then sew to the edge. You want to check, this is the line that I stitched up. So this was what I could see when I was stitching. And then on the back, I stitched on the other line as well. So things lined up nicely for me. Then we give a peek, and we want to check and make sure that any key points, such as these two, are also lining up pretty well. Before I press, I like to remove the paper just from the seam allowance. You can do this by carefully tearing. If you happen to have a water pen, which I do mention in that blog post talking about foundation paper piecing supplies, this can be a very helpful tool because it helps soften that paper. I print all of my templates on notebook paper, so this is quite helpful in making it easy to remove. So all I did was run a line right across where I stitched, and you fill this up with water at home so it never runs out. And it only takes a second and it softens it up nicely and you're ready to press. For foundation paper piecing, I tend to frequently press my seams open when I'm connecting the pieces to reduce bulk. Once you have all 4 quadrants assembled, it's time to put these quadrants together into 2 rows. I'm going to start with the top 2, and the process is the same as before. At the corner where the lines intersect, I'm putting a pin straight through, and then I'm going to put a pin straight through onto the back and match that up, keeping that pin perpendicular to both parts. Because I've removed the paper from the seams, there's going to be a little bit more flexibility down on the other end. So this time I'm going to make sure that I'm aligning my seam allowances, but I am going to tip that pin through and allow it to lay flat. So the important part was I went through, made sure I was aligned with the seam allowance on both sides, came back up in that seam allowance and up on the front as well. At this point, I add a clip to the first pin that is still perpendicular. I find that center point or close to it, put a pin straight through, and if I hit the line, which I did, I'm going to go ahead and keep that perpendicular and add a clip. If you didn't hit that back line, don't worry about it, just reposition it like you would on those corners. Again, put a perpendicular pin about halfway between the center point and one of the ends. Add that clip to make sure that it won't shift. And do the same thing between the center pin and the other end. Always check to make sure that it's lining up nicely. And add that clip. At this point, I'm going to keep the pin in at the very first end that I'll be stitching first and remove the other pins that are perpendicular. The one that I have flat is going to stay in that position until after I've stitched. Now that we're at the sewing machine, I'm going to remove the very first clip. I'm going to keep this pin in as I position my templates under the presser foot. And as that foot is coming down, I'm using a knee lift to raise and lower the presser foot. I can remove that pin and start stitching. I like to back stitch 2 or 3 stitches right as those lines intersect, and then stitch forward. As I approach the final pin, I'm going to leave it in as long as possible, but I do pull it out before I reach it with my needle. I don't want to stitch over a pin, and continue stitching to the edge of the seam. When we check our seam, look at the part you stitched with that was up, then you flip it over and check the part that you stitched while that was down on the machine, and then open and check any pertinent points. This center point is a section you want to check. Once again, I like to remove the paper that is in the seam allowance. The main part of the block, I leave that paper in until after I've assembled the entire quilt. Where I have fabric, I might go over it a couple of times with that water pen because it takes a little bit more to soak through the fabric to the paper. As you can see, it's removing pretty well. And this tore out nicely, but it's always wise to have a pair of tweezers in case you need to grab the last little bit of paper from that seam. Let's do the other side. Again, a little extra water there, and then just gently tear the paper from that seam. You will notice that there is a tiny bit of paper in this corner, so I'm going to kind of soak it. And this is where tweezers come in handy. So I reach in there. You really want to do your best to get rid of all the paper. There it comes, right out. Then we're going to press this open. We're going to repeat this same process with the lower two block quadrants, and then we're going to come back and put the whole thing together. When you have both rows complete, you're ready to put the block together. There are 3 points that we want to pay especially close attention to on this block, and the first 2 are the end points, and the third is that center point, which is probably the most visible. We're going to put these right sides together, and really the process is pretty much the same. Pin straight through the first point on both sides. Adjust if you need to. Make sure you keep that pin perpendicular. And I go ahead on longer seams and make sure I put that clip in early because it's easy for that pin to come out if it doesn't have that reinforcement. Come down to the other end. Pin straight through both the top and the bottom. Make sure that you've got those points aligned, and then add your clip. Now you want to go to the point. And at this point, you can do what I had done before and tilt your pin, but I might suggest taking one pin, going straight through the points and keeping that perpendicular while you grab another pin. It's really easy. I'm going to insert this pin almost flat to the paper, and my goal is to insert this in a way that does not cause that pin that is perpendicular to the paper and fabric to shift, because you want those points to stay that way. You don't want your fabric to shift as you put the pin through. You can see that I've gone through the seam allowance on both the front and the back, and that pin is still pretty perpendicular. So when I stitch, that should come out nicely. About halfway between the first point and the middle, I put a pin in perpendicular, put a clip right where that pin is. I come over to the side, and halfway between that middle point and the end pin, I once again put my pin perpendicular straight through both sides and put a clip on. I'm going to leave the first pin perpendicular and pull out all of the other perpendicular pins as I go over to the sewing machine. As I'm ready to sew, I remove the first clip, keep that pin, that perpendicular pin, in place until I get the presser foot down and I'm ready to begin stitching. I take a couple of stitches, and then where the lines, those outermost lines intersect, that's where I back stitch a couple of stitches, and then I move forward to keep sewing. As I approach that center point, I might peek under. Make sure that your needle's down and peek under to make sure your seam allowances are all laying in the directions that you want them to lay. And I slowly approach that center point, and right before I get there, I remove that pin. When I come to the end, I once again backstitch and stitch off the edge. Let's look and see how I did. I've stitched on top, and I stayed on the line pretty well. I flip it over, and it looks like I also did a pretty good job of stitching on that line. Now let's open it up and see where our points line up. At the top, it looks pretty good. It's looking good in the center, which is probably the most noticeable point. And it looks pretty good at the bottom too. So I'm ready to remove my paper and give my block a final press. Finished removing the paper from all of the seam allowances, and then I press that final seam open. Once you flip it over, you get to admire your finished block. Head over to the blog to find out how you can download the pattern to make this block and many others with the Quilt Concert 2023.
Thank you for joining us in making Block 4 Wheel of Fortune of the 2023 Quilt Concert Series. Please continue to follow for more fun blocks throughout the summer.